Thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting me, the folks who invited me. So I've really enjoyed listening to all the cool graphics talks over the last couple of days. And and they all have interesting human vision questions underlying a lot of them. And now so today I'm just going to talk about human vision. And in particular, peripheral vision. And I'll start by telling you what peripheral vision is and why you should care about it. But the high-level reason you should care about it is that peripheral vision is the one part of human vision where probably the most has changed about what we know since perhaps some of you took a perception class last. So there's been a lot of advances. We know a lot more than we used to know. Okay, so what is peripheral vision? So you probably know that there's a little high-resolution piece of vision right in the center where you're pointing your eyes. And in fact, if you hold out your hand at arm's length, that rod-free fovea is about the size of your thumbnail. Okay, and I can tell all of you who were paying attention later in the conference because you'll be walking around holding your thumb out at arm's length to see how big your fovea is. All right, so that's your fovea. That's the rod-free fovea. Everything else is what I'm going to call peripheral vision. And vision is generally worse in the periphery. I'm going to talk about that somewhat today. But nonetheless, it's really important to know about peripheral vision, and peripheral vision is hugely important for understanding vision. First of all, peripheral vision is vision in 99.99% of the visual field. And so sort of just automatically, it's going to be relevant for a lot of visual tasks. Most visual tasks, depending on where you're looking at a given moment, have relevant information somewhere in the periphery. And peripheral vision is going to, if you can use peripheral vision to process that information, your performance is going to be better than if you have to move your eyes around, okay? Nonetheless, peripheral vision is, it turns out, quirky and weird. It's really quite good for some visual tasks, and it's really quite not good for other visual tasks. And what this means is that if we can understand peripheral vision, it turns out we can go a long way towards guessing what visual tasks would be easy for a human and what visual tasks would be hard for a human. It's like one-stop shopping for understanding a lot of vision, okay? But to get at what's true about peripheral vision, we have to start with some very pervasive myths about peripheral vision. And you'll often see something like an image like this, which is supposed to visualize what peripheral vision is like. You might hear that it's got terrible resolution, and in fact, it's blurry. And that, for instance, is why you move your eyes to read, that you can't possibly read because of the low resolution in the periphery. You can't possibly read without moving your eyes. Another thing you might hear is that you have essentially no color vision. And if you think you see color out of the periphery, you're imagining it. Like your brain knows the grass is supposed to be green because of some previous time you pointed your eyes at the grass, and so it just happily hallucinates green for you in the periphery. You're just imagining it, okay? And these myths are very pervasive. There's some sort of follow-on myths. People will say because of this low resolution and the poor color vision, peripheral vision is all but useless, and it only really serves to guide that high-resolution fovea to the interesting bits for further processing. And the claim then is that fovea is where the real vision happens. Peripheral vision is just this subservient thing in service of the fovea vision, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk about these myths and why they're not true and what's really true. And I want to be clear at the beginning that it's easy to see why these myths are so pervasive. I mean, some of them involve some kind of subtle misunderstandings of what we know about vision. And so it's totally fine if you believe any of these things. It's completely understandable. I'm sure that some past Ruth also thought these things until I thought about it some more. And then I forgot about this last bit. The last sort of corollary myth is that if you want to know what someone is thinking about, what they're focused on currently, I don't like to say it, but paying attention to, then what you need is to get an eye tracker. And then the eye tracker, just by looking at where they're pointing their eyes, you'll know what they're paying attention to. And that's sort of the last little bit of myth that we'll talk about. Okay. And that's just to remind you, these are myths. I'm always a little wary of putting up all these things at the beginning. There'll be people who walk out of the room and think, Ruth said, there's terrible resolution in the periphery and color vision is bad, but no, myths. Okay. So like I say, it's pretty easy to understand why people have these misunderstandings. And an awful lot of them come from, interestingly enough, misunderstanding cone density plots. So you probably know there's two main kinds of photoreceptors in vision. There's the rods and the cones. The cones are the ones that are responsible for most vision in the daytime. And they also, they fill the fovea. and they are responsible for doing color discrimination, cones are. So cones are what we're going to be talking about today. And you'll see plots like this that show cone density, number per square millimeter in the retina, as a function of eccentricity. That's the distance from the point of fixation on out. So 0 there on the x-axis is where the fovea is pointed, and you can see how it drops off precipitously. The cone density drops off very precipitously as you go out into the peripheral retina. And so people quite reasonably look at this and say, oh my gosh, peripheral vision must be just terrible and not good for anything, yada yada, right? But it turns out there's a subtlety here, which is that if you want to know about performance, how well people will do on visual tasks, density is the wrong measure, okay? What you really want to know about is something known as acuity. Acuity is, you can think of it as what's the smallest thing you can resolve, or you can also think of it in many cases as, it's often in terms of spacing, the spacing you can resolve in the visual field. And acuity is really the thing that's important for tasks, not this cone density. There's a reason why your eye charts, when you go into the eye doctor, look something like this. They want to measure how far apart those lines have to be for you to tell which direction the E is pointing, right? That's about acuity. So if you want to know how far apart two details have to be in order for you to be able to resolve them, that's not about the number of cones you have per square millimeter. That is about the cone spacing, okay? Because that spacing between neighboring cones is going to determine whether or not you see one line or two, all right? So just doing like the units calculation and stuff, the density is number per square millimeter. Cone spacing is going to go at something like 1 over the square root of the density, right? And 1 over the square root is going to look a lot different than the density. So let's see what that looks like. Here on the left is the usual cone density plot. On the right is 1 over the square root of the density. And you can see that that looks a lot less scary. That dark line in the bottom there, that's the graph, right? And so it's not flat. It's going up approximately linearly over a pretty broad range. I blew up a little part in the corner so you can tell that it's not just at 0. It is going up, but it's going up a very small amount. You're just up into the handful of arc minutes in terms of the spacing you can resolve at the very, very far eccentricity, okay? And we can have another way of visualizing that this is really not so scary. You can take an image like the one on the left here and the fixations at the center. And on the right, what I've done is I've blurred this. You'll notice it gets blurrier the farther you get from that plus sign, right? From the fixation. And it's basically been blurred to mimic the loss of acuity. And I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that vision is blurry in the periphery. I'm just saying that you can blur to reduce the high spatial frequencies, reduce the high spatial frequency detail, and you can use this as a visualization of that, okay? And I can show you that, I can blow up a portion of that, and you can see that it's certainly not nothing. There is a difference between the original image and that point that's farther out into the periphery, but it's a pretty small effect. And going back actually to the original image, just so you can see it again, you can imagine there'd be an awful lot of tasks that you would do just fine if that was your loss of resolution, right? And many of you can explore this on your own. If you want to know what tasks you can do with way more reduction in resolution than you have for much of the visual field, you just take your glasses off, right? That's way worse than most of my peripheral vision for my prescription, probably for many of you. Okay, so you would imagine that peripheral vision would be pretty good for an awful lot if this was the only problem with peripheral vision. And this notion that because of poor peripheral acuity, you have to move your eyes to see the interesting bits. Here I'm showing you 2 different fixations on the same scene. And you should just notice how little difference that change in fixation makes. This is about a 5 degrees of Cobb if you treat this image as being like a 20 degree wide image. And there, an awful lot of the scene just looks the same. Like maybe it's a little harder to read the text in the periphery when you're fixating more than 5 degrees away from the text. Maybe the acuity is kind of poor, but mostly, you wouldn't gain a lot by moving your eyes. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I'm using a trick here from Adobe Photoshop, which Stuart Anstis, one of the really great peripheral vision researchers, has pointed out that you can use their radial blur function to mimic this this linear reduction in resolution with eccentricity. And so even that little amount of blur that I'm showing you is actually a 4 times exaggeration of how much you need to reduce the resolution. There's sort of 2 reasons why people tend to show you that amount of blur or even more. The first is you actually can't turn the Adobe Photoshop blur down anymore. So I have to show you at least that amount of blur. And the second reason is that if I did turn it down to what it really is, a lot of you would be sitting there in the audience saying, I can't see anything. So in fact, many books will show you an even more exaggerated blur, supposedly to mimic the loss of acuity. And in fact, related to that, is the loss of acuity why you move your eyes to read? Well, also from Stuart Anstis, this is a plot where each of those letters is at the threshold size it needs to be for you to just read it with a certain % accuracy if you fixate the middle. So if you fixate the middle, you should be about 70% correct at all of those letters. Now, you would not want to read at a size at which you're 70% correct for every letter, right? That would be painful. But nonetheless, if that's the threshold, you could imagine that you could read, a slightly bigger font. You could read an entire page of text without moving your eyes, right? So loss of acuity is not why you move your eyes to read. Now, why do we think it is? Well, because often what you see in books looks more like this. This is a much more satisfying demo. First of all, you're unhappy looking at 70% correct. It doesn't seem like you can see any of the letters very well. Here, at least, if you fixate the center, you probably do feel like they're all equally readable, right? So that's kind of makes it a better demo. But when you look at this, you think, and I've seen this in books, it'll say, oh my gosh, look at how much bigger you have to make the letters as you go out into the periphery. Peripheral vision is terrible, yada, yada. But again, there's kind of a subtle thing here, which is that those letters now are 10 times the threshold size you need to read them, which means, if you think about it, that the rate at which they increase is 10 times the rate you need to increase the letter size. And to make matters worse, often you see these plots and they don't even tell you they've exaggerated it. They just tell you, like, acuity gets terrible in the periphery. Here's a demonstration. So it's very easy to peruse the literature and come away very confused about peripheral vision. All right. So what about color perception? And again, the myth is that you can't really see color and your brain is just filling it in, et cetera. And this too kind of tends to come from a misunderstanding of these plots. Here I'm showing you a different one that shows both rods and cones. And the point is that to show how high the cone density is in the middle, you often kind of lose the detail at the tails, right? And so what many of these plots look like is that you get this very high peak in the middle and it looks like it goes to 0 outside of like maybe 20 degrees of eccentricity. But that's a plotting problem. And if you actually blow it up, you can tell that it doesn't really go down to 0. In fact, even at the lowest level, it's at like 4,000 cones per square millimeter, which is not bad. And I'd like to point out also, these are the receptors responsible for your daylight vision. So if you're seeing anything at all in the periphery, that's because you have cones there, right? And in fact, people have done experiments and color perception stood out to at least about 40 degrees eccentricity, so long as you make the patches large enough. And what this plot here is showing you is for red, green, or blue-ish patches. How big do you need to make those patches to make your color judgments approximately what they are in the fovea? And you can see that they're pretty small still out to about 40 degrees. People's color perception is about as good as when they're looking at a 1 degree patch in the center of their vision. Okay. And by the way, we know your brain isn't just filling this in because people do careful experiments, and you would be performing terribly if you were just guessing based on like what you knew the colors to be. These are Gabor patches. No one knows what color they're supposed to be. The full story is more complicated, but this is this simple version. All right, so why does it seem, as you might have been while you listened to me introspecting on what you can see in the periphery, why does it seem like peripheral vision is so bad then? And it turns out it's not about acuity. Peripheral vision is really sensitive to clutter, to having extra stuff in the visual field near the thing that you're trying to see. And this is known as visual crowding. This is the important, significant, and really interesting loss of information in peripheral vision. And the basic phenomenology was studied with letters. You can see the effect here. If you fixate that top plus and try and see the letter that's off to your left, it should be relatively easy to see that isolated letter. If you fixate the next plus, it becomes harder when you flank that central letter with nearby flankers. And then if you move those flankers farther and farther apart, at some critical spacing, it becomes easy again. So it's again easy to read that central feed. This is known as visual crowding. It's a little bit of an unfair comparison, but just to get a sense of how much worse this gets with eccentricity than the acuity, here I'm plotting out the blue line is grading acuity. That's how far apart sort of the bars in the grading have to be for you to tell that there are multiple bars and it's not just homogeneous. The green line is letter acuity. How big do the letters have to be as a function of eccentricity for you to read them? And then critical spacing of crowding is the yellow line. You can see how much worse that gets, how much more quickly that gets bad as you go out into the periphery. Crowding is like a much bigger effect, and it's important for a lot of visual tasks. And it turns out it's a little confusing to understand. It's a very rich, interesting phenomenology. It's a little hard to guess in advance what things are going to be really crowded and hard to do and what things will be easy. And you can get a sense of some of the phenomenology here. You can just fixate any of those pluses, try to read the next bunch of text off to your right. And some of the stuff to the far right is people's previous results on that text. So a lot of what people report is that you get high spatial frequency detail, but it's jumbled in some way. There's loss of position information or phase information. So sometimes with letter arrays, people will swap entire letters, so you'll see them in the wrong order. Sometimes, and that's like, you can see that in the Fern example, people in an experiment reported FREU instead. Some letters flip, like that N to the U case. But in some cases, it's more complicated. You'll take a piece of an A and a piece of a B, and you stick them together into some new letter that wasn't in the display at all. So they can get jumbled even within things in the display. It also has, this is not remotely just about letters. You can see it with just about any stimuli. Here, if you fixate the cross and, the star, and try to see the path of the brown subway line in the map, okay? Super hard. Now keep fixating that star. I'm going to take away the clutter, and it now becomes much easier to see. And in fact, you can see all those little dashes, right? So you've got plenty of acuity out there. Nice sharp line that you're probably perceiving and so on. And of course, like much of the world is cluttered and complex. So you can imagine that this phenomenology is going to have impact on a lot of vision. All right? It doesn't require that you have objects flanking other objects. If you fixate that square and try and see the face, it'll seem jumbled within the face itself. This is sometimes called self-crowding. It doesn't just, it doesn't have to do just with object recognition. That was a misunderstanding for a long time. Pretty much any visual task, you could have the clutter being as having some kind of impact. That suggests that it might have something to do with a fairly low-level kind of encoding of the visual world that's storing away information in the periphery. And another interesting aspect is that it's very stimulus-specific. So if you fixate the central pluses again, you'll find it easier to see the central symbol on the right than on the left. When the flankers are similar to each other and fairly different from the item in the middle, it's much easier to see that sort of salient, unusual item in the middle than it is when they're all similar. Okay. So that's one phenomenology. Another thing is it depends a lot on the complexity. It's hard to get the detail on this complicated house drawing, and like O's are like super easy to read in the periphery if they're on their own. Nice simple stimulus. Whatever simple and complex means, it seems to matter. Okay. Okay, so what's going on here? What is the underlying mechanism? There's been a lot of behavioral work done in the last 20 years or more, and they kind of converged on one general way of thinking about this. And Lethin has this great paper from 1976. If you want to read a paper that practically could not exist anymore today, this guy just looked, one subject, looked at a bunch of stimuli and described what he saw. It is really too bad in ways that we can't get some papers published like that now. But anyway, so he does a lot of experiments with his own peripheral vision. You can try them for yourself. But anyway, he says that if you fixate the middle again, that isolated N on its own has some kind of has some kind of form-like thing that the embedded end doesn't. And that the embedded end just seems to have some kind of statistical existence. And a lot of this stuff I've told you so far to a human vision person sounds like we're talking about texture perception. You care about the details, but not exactly where they are. You don't care that much. You can shift the details in a texture. In many cases, it still looks like the same texture. And in fact, Letman says that. He says, this makes him think that texture, maybe somewhat redefined, is the primitive stuff, the encoding, if you will, out of which form is constructed. And a lot of other folks have said something similar. The people kind of come to this idea that peripheral vision is doing some kind of forced texture perception. It's doing texture perception even when you don't have a texture task and you aren't looking at a texture. You have some kind of compulsory statistical processing, some kind of pooling or averaging of features over big areas, and that is what is responsible for crowding. So in my lab, we decided to take this literally and see if we could come up with a model of this. And at the time, at least, the state-of-the-art model of texture perception was Portilla and Sinicelli. They have a texture analysis synthesis model of texture perception. Many of you may know it because it also sort of played a role in some graphics applications. The idea is that within each patch, you would measure a very rich set of summary statistics, summary image statistics, lots of correlations between vertical stuff and horizontal stuff, and vertical stuff at one scale with vertical stuff at another scale, those kinds of statistics, as well as things like mean luminance and things like that. You measure a whole bunch of them over the entire texture patch. So like one of these inner squares, you measure those statistics, and then you can synthesize new texture, which now appears in the surround down below, by starting with something like random noise and iteratively applying these statistical constraints that you've measured until you get something that, like if you look really closely, you can tell that it's not quite right in many cases. Like in the coffee beans, that's an excellent example, but kind of like at first glance, it looks like the same texture. And so both the fact that it isn't perfect and that it seems to be a good representation of how we think about texture, how the visual system processes texture, suggested this was a good place to start for a crowding model. And then you just have to do the work to turn it into a peripheral vision model. That means it needs to be eccentricity dependent. And essentially, instead of measuring statistics over the whole image, which would just give you a terrible result, we're now measuring local statistics over these pooling regions that get bigger as a function of eccentricity in accordance with what we know about that critical spacing that I talked about before. And so as you get further from fixation, you're losing more and more detail. You could think of it in terms of compression. You're compressing more and more radically, lower quality. And that this is potentially a model of peripheral crowding. And so the cool thing about this is since we built it on top of this texture analysis synthesis model, we can take an original image, we can put down a fixation, we can lay down these pooling regions, and we can synthesize new images like the one on the right that are visualizations of the information that's available if this model is correct. Okay? It's sort of like before when I blurred to show you the loss of information due to acuity. Now we can do this sort of jumbling to show you this loss of information due to crowding. And because this is statistical, you can do it multiple times, and I recommend that. And by looking at these visualizations, you get a sense of what the model is saying is easily available in peripheral vision. That's the stuff that's consistently clear in these visualizations, versus stuff that's getting lost. And that's the stuff where either it is just never clear or it's not consistently clear. That stuff's going to be harder to see in peripheral vision. And so, for instance, like, you'll first of all notice just like how much information there is for getting like the gist of a scene here, right? Because both of those, you look at them, it's a street, that's a bus stop, etc. You can probably even tell that there's text on the bus stop, but you might be hard pressed to read the text. You can tell that there's cars on the road, but you wouldn't necessarily know the details, like what kind of car and how many cars and so on. And of course, since this is representing things as texture, some things that are kind of like texture get represented great in the periphery most of the time. So the model does well with the building and the tree and stuff like that. Okay. Now, before I showed you a visualization of whether or not it matters much to move your eyes, if acuity is the only issue. Now that's the same image, the same two fixation points, but now I'm showing you that actually kind of does matter where you point your eyes because of crowding, okay? Now, it's still true that the images look a lot alike, and the fact that you can get a lot of the same information from those two fixations is probably a lot of what gives us sort of a sense of a stable visual world as we move our eyes around and look at different parts of things, right? But nonetheless, now it matters. So if you look at that X that's on the car compared to the X that's on the person's face, you know, when it's on the car, you don't see the lights in the periphery that well. You now have significantly worse time reading those signs, right? On the flip side, if you are fixating that guy's face, I'm afraid you maybe don't know about that bicyclist that's approaching, and so it's that bicyclist is in danger if you're not looking at the forward roadway. Okay, so now it matters where you look. Okay, so you'd probably like to know whether or not this model works at all. And so we've tested on a lot of conditions. The first thing, of course, you'd think to test it on is you can run a lot of these, like the original experiments, like people used to study crowding in the first place. You're fixating somewhere in the periphery. You have some central symbol or object or something that you're trying to recognize. It's linked with all sorts of different other symbols and objects, and you're just supposed to identify that central letter. So each of these symbols is a different condition. The vertical axis is the human performance. You're fixating, you have to identify what percentage correct you get, and the x-axis is the model performance. And there's essentially no parameters in this model. I'm not like fitting anything here. You can see that the model does a pretty good job of predicting this peripheral symbol recognition, right? So this is like the bare minimum that you would like out of a crowding model, and sure enough, it looks like it does a pretty good job. But it's not just that kind of obvious thing to test that this works on. So you can also look at search experiments where you either, for instance, ask someone to search for a red among green, which is pretty easy, or you ask them to look for a T among L's of different rotations, which is fairly hard. And it does pretty well in this too. Again, every symbol is a different condition. The search difficulty, it has to do with the efficiency with which you can search, so it's the speed relative to the number of items in the display. Is on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the model prediction. Here, what we're asking the model to do is tell us how easy it is to tell the target from the other items in the crowded periphery. And that does a pretty darn good job of predicting search difficulty, which isn't even what we set out to predict with the crowding model. You can then look at a more specific kind of search where you've heard about change blindness. This is what that is. So you have some original image like this one at the top here, and then you change some detail in the image. And then the subject has to find what you changed. They have no idea what you changed or where it is. So in this case, if you can see the engine on the plane disappeared, see where that is. This is a hard one, by the way. And it turns out peripheral vision has a lot to say about how difficult this is. Because you can imagine that if you're searching for stuff, if you notice it in the periphery, then you'll very quickly find it. And if you can't see it in the periphery, it's going to be hard. And in fact, if we look at, sometimes it's easy to detect the change and sometimes it's harder. If we look at the easy cases, it turns out that if you know what the change is, you can see the difference between the two images, even fixating like 5 or 10 degrees away from the change. Whereas in the hard cases, sometimes you have to fixate practically on the change to tell what it is. Even when you know what it is, you have a hard time seeing those two images unless you're fixating really close. And that does a good job of predicting change detection difficulty, and the model can predict that fairly well, so we can also explain that. And then getting even further away from the kind of what we started with, you can ask people to fixate the center of scenes, and they get to see it for a limited time, and then you ask them questions like, is there a right turn coming up in this scene? And again, you can see, compare the fixating human to the model, and it does a pretty good job of predicting performance on these scene tasks also. All right, so, and all told, we're at more than 70 tasks we've asked the model to predict. It does a pretty good job in general. There's certainly variance left to be explained, like the model could be improved, but it's doing a pretty good job. And so what do we make of this? And I think it's not just that the model is working well. I want to be clear about two somewhat subtle take-home messages here. One is that the reason this works must suggest, like, because you would imagine that, like, ultimately scene perception, you need to actually do some scene-specific thing to do scene perception, right? Like, why is this peripheral vision model explaining scene perception and search and everything else, right? Surely there's, like, other mechanisms involved that make these tasks easier part. The fact that the one model predicts performance on a lot of these tasks suggests that the strengths and limitations of peripheral vision are essentially a critical limit on a lot of visual tasks. And so if you can understand what things are easy in peripheral vision and hard, you can predict performance in a diversity of tasks because it's this critical limit. Because it's, you know, you can imagine acuity could have been this way for some tasks, right? If you just don't have the acuity for the task, then you know that the task is hard. This is the same idea, but for crowding. And the second sort of subtle thing is we must actually be using peripheral vision for these tasks. Because if we weren't using peripheral vision to do the search, to do the scene perception, then the model peripheral vision wouldn't do a good job. Okay? All right. And that brings us to the last part of the myth and the last thing that we need to know about peripheral vision, which is, what is peripheral vision used for? It should be pretty clear by now that it's not just for directing your eyes, your high resolution phobia to the interesting bits, right? And so where do we point our eyes? What we do use peripheral vision for, and I'll give you some examples of some speculative, some we know a lot about from real world tasks. But first I want to give you a little bit of the experience with it yourself. So you're going to look at this plus, and I'm going to flash up a scene, and you just try and see how much you can see at a glance. All right, everybody ready? Okay, so you probably saw, like, there's probably a lot of details you're not sure about, right? But you probably saw there's two people, maybe one is an adult woman and one is a child, and maybe it's like a classroom scene or something. They're either like high-fiving or maybe playing a clapping game or something like that. Maybe even saw like the kids wearing a striped shirt, right? This is what the image actually looked like. And now we can use your newly reminded skill. You can hold out your hand at arm's length and put up your thumb and point the thumb at that green plus and see just how much of that did you do with your peripheral vision, right? Quite a lot that peripheral vision is doing. So there's lots of useful information for lots of tasks. Visual system in general is pretty darn efficient, so probably it's making use of this information. Okay, so for what? And I think one of the underappreciated things that peripheral vision is good for is simply looking at big objects, by which I mean objects that subtend a large fraction of your visual field. Next time you're having a conversation with someone, how much is your phobia, right? And here's the model prediction where you're looking like between this woman's eyes and like, look, her whole face looks great. You know, you get lots of information. You don't have trouble reading people's facial expressions. You don't have to keep moving your eyes to the right. And facial expressions are fast too sometimes. There's these little micro expressions that carry a lot of social meaning. So this is probably very important for social, getting social cues. And certainly your eye tracker would be correct most of the time that you were actually kind of focusing on her and you were kind of focusing on the bear if you're fixating the middle of the bear. But on the other hand, you shouldn't take it too literally. You know, you're probably weren't focused on the center of her glasses. And there's not much going on at the center of the bear. We often fixate the middle of objects, and there's often not much there in the middle of objects. You probably do it because you're trying to balance like where the information is and get the best view you can of that bear, okay? All right, so probably looking at big objects. And not just fixating the middle of the bear, we often, in many real tasks, we fixate between the interesting bits, not on the interesting bits, especially when things are time critical. That's one of the really critical things. And so for instance, in driving, we spend an awful lot of time looking at the forward roadway just a little bit ahead of us. Now, it's certainly true that sometimes there's a car there, and that almost certainly helps us maintain our distance to the car and see the brake lights really easily and stuff like that. But you can see from this model visualization, like you can also get a great view of those lane markers, right? And we know that people tend to fixate between the lane markers, not look at the lane markers to stay in their lane. It's probably a good balance of information. And you can also even tell, like you might be hard pressed in your periphery to know that that was a horse coming at you, but you can nonetheless tell that there's some kind of hazard, potential hazard in that lane that's next to you using your peripheral vision. And we've done experiments where we have people look for a diversity of hazards, and it's known that people will start responding to the hazard, like they'll start hitting the brakes before they ever fixate the hazard. So we know people use peripheral vision for this. Okay? All right. And another good example of time-critical stuff is most sports. You often have to worry about, even those saccades, these fast eye movements you make between fixations, even though they're very fast, nonetheless, things can happen so fast in the sports game that you don't want to fixate between the interesting bits. And so there's two main behaviors where you see this in sports. One is you actually you're using peripheral vision in this case on the left to monitor two locations. And it is because you want to direct your fovea to the interesting bits. And you want to sit between so that you can at the last minute make a quick motion to one of them. But there's also lots of cases like on the right where there's just not enough time to look at the interesting bits. And so even though peripheral vision is imperfect, you make the best use you can out of it. You fixate between the ball and the player and try and figure out when they're going to hit it, where they're going to hit it, and so on. And if you looked at your eye tracker, naively, you'd think they were like looking at the bush in the back. That's not probably what the person's actually focused on. They're balancing information. Okay. Oh, and I should mention, part of the reason that you want to do strategies like this is that, as you probably know, you're like practically blind during a saccade and during a fast eye movement. And so you don't want to, you want as much as possible, if you can get away in sports with like not moving your eyes, that's great because then you don't miss anything. Okay. Walking is less time critical, but nonetheless, it tends to balance a lot of different tasks. You're often kind of multitasking in walking. You want to see the scene ahead of you for navigation purposes. You want to make sure you don't bump into anything. That can be like these pedestrians on both sides. You want to stay in your path and stuff like that. And you also need to do foot placement, right? And you want to make sure that you're not going to stumble and so on. And you're so essentially multitasking. And so what people tend to do, especially in scenes like this, is look a little bit ahead. And of course, you can move your eyes. It's not that time critical. But they tend to look a little bit ahead. You can then, of course, see the world ahead of you. But more than that, like look how clear the path is according to the model. Even down pretty close to your feet, you can see things pretty well. You can tell enough to stay on your path and not hit those people who are walking next to you. Peripheral vision can do an awful lot while you're walking. Pretty much the only time you look down, really down, as you probably know if you hike, is when like the footing is really unstable, right? And then people will go back and forth between your feet and looking ahead, and they'll walk slowly. And the reason is because if you're looking down at your feet, like the tree branches coming at you aren't just peripheral, they're like flat out of your field of view. I've gotten hit in the head with tree branches exactly this way. I'm sure you have too. Anyway, so in that case, you very much see these behaviors going back and forth. More speculatively, I think there's a lot of comparison tasks for which we almost certainly use peripheral vision. If you look in the middle of this brain, it's easy to tell whether or not it's symmetric and to what degree it deviates from symmetry. If you want to find the tallest orange bar in this plot, like you could look at one bar and kind of memorize its height and then look at the next bar and compare that to what your memory is. But that sounds kind of hard, right? I mean, that's like really relying on memory. And why do that? You can look at one bar and you can just use your peripheral vision to compare. So assuming that the graph is good enough, you can use peripheral vision to compare the bars and tell which one is taller. We also know to some extent that people use peripheral vision to judge things like where is this person looking, because people will make the judgment without having fixated both the object and the person doing the looking. So we know you use peripheral vision for that. You can imagine probably a lot of comparison tasks. A lot of shape perception tasks are kind of comparing this part of the object to this part of the object, or the shading here to the shading here. And almost certainly we're using some peripheral vision for that purpose. Now, of course, I gave you all these examples that sort of deviate from the myth of moving your eyes to the interesting bits. There are, of course, things where you actually do point your eyes to the interesting bits. Aiming at something that's far away, people pretty much just look at that archery target. When you're trying to read text, because of crowding, not acuity, you really do have a different set of words that are available depending on where you fixate. If you use an eye tracker in this case, it probably correctly guess you're fixating on, you're interested in that archery target and that you're reading those words. But even then, you that may not be all that you're doing. I mean, if you're seeing that page of the text while you're walking around looking at your book, I pretty much guarantee you you're also using your peripheral vision to monitor the surround and avoid obstacles and bumping into things, even though you might not be aware that you're doing that. This is another exercise to send you home with, other than figuring out how big your fovea is. Pay attention a bit to like, when did you realize that something was happening in your periphery that you weren't like monitoring for consciously, and that your visual system just provided you with this information in your periphery. One of my favorites is when you're standing in a supermarket and someone comes up and they get in your way, and you like step back so that they have a path. Pay attention to what you notice in peripheral vision. I think it's pretty cool. Okay. All right. So in summary, I hope I've convinced you that peripheral vision is actually super cool. It's not just this kind of boring loss of acuity, but rather there's this really interesting, very rich phenomenology of visual crowding. And the crowding, the strengths and limitations of peripheral vision because of crowding are really an important determinant of performance on a really wide range of visual tasks. And the cool part about that is that if you can understand peripheral vision, peripheral crowding, you can go a long way to understanding and predicting how difficult or easy visual tasks will be. There's a lot of new phenomenology in the last 20 years or so, so there's a lot that we know. And because it's a very complex set of phenomenology, it's helpful that we have this model that seems to do a pretty good job of predicting what's going on. Now, of course, you might be thinking, can I just literally look at these visualizations and tell what information is available? And of course, there's other things that can be in play. You could be, distracted. You're thinking about something. You're doing some other task. That will affect the degree to which you can use this information. So you should kind of think of the model as giving you like an upper bound of the information available in the periphery. And I've also talked about what do you actually use peripheral vision for. So and you use it for a lot. This means understanding your eye tracker output could be somewhat complicated. You can't just do it sort of naively. The reason you use peripheral vision for a lot is both that there just tends to be task-relevant information across the visual field for many visual tasks. And also, peripheral vision, the use of peripheral vision is full of trade-offs because there's this imperfect information in the periphery, but there's cost to trying to do everything with eye movements, both in terms of time and the information you lose during the eye movement, and also because in many cases it's probably more of a memory load to try to use only foveal vision. Again, like go around looking through like a tube or something and see what tasks are hard when you do that. Okay, and so the high level thing there is that peripheral vision, rather than being sort of just subservient to foveal vision, just serving to guide your eye movements so that your fovea points at the interesting bits, in many cases, peripheral vision is actually where the real vision happens. This is how I suggest you think about it. Anyhow, thanks a lot to all of you and to some students and postdocs who particularly helped with the work in here. Thanks.